Okay, today we are going to talk about listening, and listening is important for a number of reasons. Number one is that if you look at this pie chart over here, you can see that this is from some research that came out pretty recently in 2008, and this particular study found that roughly 55% of our time spent communicating is listening. And so this can be seen on the red parts of the pie chart over on the right hand side. And we think of this as both interpersonal listening, but also media listening. So, listening to a television or listening to a song or any type of media listening. And so, not only is this something that is the majority or makes up the majority of our communication, um, and is the most common communication behavior. And some studies would say anywhere between 40 and 60% of our time communicating is listening. It kind of depends on which study you see, but most are between 40 and 60%. But even more research is showing how important um, listening is. And when, for example, one study done, Brownell and Wolven in 2010 found that listening skills were the top skills that employers were looking for in potential employees. But it's not just in an employer-employee relationship dynamic; it's also in interpersonal and romantic relationships. And listening is considered to be a really important part of relational satisfaction. So, listening is important, even if it's not something we naturally think about all the time. At least I know I don't think about listening all the time. We're going to think about listening in these terms. These are some of Alder's thoughts on listening, and Alder defines this concept of listening as the process of receiving and responding to others' messages. So, traditionally approaches tend to be things like spoken word, but it's not just verbal communication. Listening also takes place through the mediated channels that we talked about back in week one. Some of them are through the written word, but listening is also an action, right? It's a skill. And so it's not just the part of taking in what someone else is saying, but it's also paying attention to what they're saying, paying attention to their nonverbal cues, offering your own nonverbal cues that show that you are listening. I always think about how often I see, and honestly, how often I've done this too. Um, and that is where I'm talking to someone else, but I'm also texting while I'm listening to what the other person has to say. My wife today was just in fact telling me about something, and right as she was telling me, I got my attention got drawn to my email, and I got a really important email message, and so I kind of like stopped listening to her. I was hearing what she said, but I wasn't listening to what she said, and that's an important distinction to make. What is hearing? What is listening? Hearing is the physiological act of biologically hearing words in terms of they come into your ear, okay, and it's the physiological process. But listening is more than that. Listening is not just the reception of words, but it's the response to words, and that's an important distinction to think about. I want you to pull out a piece of paper, and I'm going to go through, and I want you to number it from 1 to 24. And you don't need to write down all these different um, uh, items that are on this little profile quiz. But I want you to write down a number next to each of the 24 items that I'm going to give you. And it's going to be on a 7-point scale from 1, which is strongly disagree, to 7, which is strongly agree. And then at the end, we'll add up some scores and we'll see what listening style is the one that you tend to go to. And this is from the Revised Listening Styles Profile, which is a 2013 and probably the most popular listening uh, uh, survey out there to understand listening styles. So I'm going to go through these quickly, but then you can always pause, and I'm going to go 8 um, items on each screen, so you can always pause at the 8th one. When listening to others, it is important to understand the feelings of the speaker. I wait until all the facts are presented before forming judgments and opinions. I am impatient with people who ramble on during conversations. When listening to others, I focus on any inconsistencies or errors in what's being said. When listening to others, I'm mainly concerned with how they are feeling. Number 6, I tend to withhold judgment about another's ideas until I've heard everything they have to say. I get frustrated when people get off topic during a conversation. Number 8, I often catch errors in other speakers' logic. We're moving on to number 9, I listen to understand the emotions and mood of the speaker. Number 10, when listening to others, I attempt to withhold making an opinion until I've heard the entire message. When listening to others, I appreciate speakers who give brief to the point presentations. I tend to naturally notice errors in what other speakers say. I listen primarily to build and maintain relationships with others. When listening to others, I consider all sides of the issue before responding. When listening to others, I become impatient when they appear to be wasting time. I have a talent for catching inconsistencies in what a speaker says. Moving on to number 17. I enjoy listening to others because it allows me to connect with them. I fully listen to what a person has to say before forming any opinions. I prefer speakers who quickly get to the point. When listening to others, I notice contradictions in what they say. When listening to others, I focus on understanding the feelings behind the words. To be fair to others, I fully listen to what they have to say before making judgments. I find it difficult to listen to people who take too long to get their ideas across. Good listeners catch discrepancies in what people say. And those are the 24 items in this style, so in this profile. So I want you to go ahead and add up along these categories. In category 1, add up the numbers between questions 1, 5, 9, 13, 17, and 21. Category 2, add up your answers from 2, 6, 10, 14, 18, 22. Category 3, add up 3, 7, 11, 15, 19, and 23. And in category 4, add up 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and 24. And you'll come up with your sum totals of each of those categories. Okay, you can go ahead and pause this video now to add those up if you need. And we'll move on. So we'll just go through each of these categories here. The sum of category 1 is related to relational listening. The sum of category 2 is related to analytical listening. The sum of category 3 is related to transactional listening. And the sum of category 4 is related to critical listening. And we're going to look at each one of these types of listening styles. What are the pros and cons of each? What are the focuses of each? And I want you to think about this in terms of your own life. And perhaps you have 2 categories that you notice you have higher scores or lower scores. And think about how you interweave these. And maybe sometimes you have those friends that you feel like you need to be more relational to. And then you have some friends who you feel like you need to be more transactional with. But think about why there might be some differences among these categories for you. It's important to note that not one of these listening styles is the ideal listening style. Each of them has pros and cons. And so Bodie and Worthington came up with what we consider to be sort of the main listening styles, although depending on other studies that you read or other classes that you take that talk about listening, they might have different listening styles that they talk about. But these are the ones that we're going to go with in this class. And the first one is relational. And the relational listening style is really focused on, number 1, feelings. Okay, so when we are in conversation with someone else, what is that person saying? But maybe more importantly to relational people is, how do they feel? What are some of the things that are not being said? Okay, and so an obvious pro to this is that by paying close attention to emotions, The relational style people tend to be really good at empathy and comfort. And um, but on the flip side, again, there's no one perfect of style. Um, it's really common for the relational styles, the people who are relational style, to really struggle with critically analyzing what is going on with the other person. Um, I remember very clearly. I definitely find myself in the relational style, and I remember very clearly um, back in maybe 2005 or six. I went out to coffee with one of my best friends, and he was telling me about some girl troubles, and um, I was very empathetic, and I was trying to be very comforting. And then finally he asked me, okay, but what do you think I should do? And I was kind of drawing a blank because it is a little out of my comfort zone to try to be critical of someone else. Um, and instead, it's really easy for me to show empathy, and that's it. And so sometimes this is kind of surface level, um, to some degree. And I know that that is something, ever since that occurred, that's something I've been working on in my own life. A second type of listening style is the analytical style. And these people tend to be focused on gathering information, how much information can be gathered, and thinking carefully about what was or is being said. And so our analytical people are really good at acquiring information, asking good questions to get more information, and then making sense of the information. And if you think about, if you've ever gone to therapists or counselors, you're going to come across different listening styles. As someone who's gone to therapy and counseling myself, I've come across people who are relational, but I've also come across people who are analytical, and I find that super helpful for me, who's more relational, because I'm not as good at expressing or getting information from people and making sense of it. I'm better at showing concern. And so people who are more analytical are really helpful to me personally because they help draw out information that I might not have otherwise thought about or gotten. But the problem with analytical people is oftentimes they get too caught up in that information and tend to put feelings aside. Thirdly, there's the transactional listening style, and these people want to get to the point. Okay, they don't really care about collecting all the information. They just want to get to the nuts and bolts of the problem. Okay, and so one really great thing about these people who are transactional uh, is that they are really good at evaluating what is important and what is not important. If you think about, it's not just collecting information, but it's being able to sift through and say, okay, this has nothing to do with this, and instead we need to get to the point and talk or focus on this one thing. Okay, so transactional listeners really dislike people who take too long to express their ideas. They really get frustrated with that, or people who they see as going off on tangents. Okay, because they'd rather just get to the point. So again, the pro is evaluating, but the cons is that perhaps this is when someone can get too caught up on simple inconsistencies in a story or minor errors, and as a result, they tend to get distracted by the things that don't necessarily make sense to them. Okay, so um, in some ways, it's like they're so focused on getting to the point of the story that they don't see the forest through the trees. If you've heard that expression before, and so yeah, those are our transactional people, and then our critical people um, are focused on the accuracy of the speaker's messages, and so they're really good at getting things accomplished. They don't really care necessarily about getting to the point right away, but they want to get things done. They want to fix the issue. They want to fix the issue. And so, in order to fix the issue, what we need to do is we need to make sure everything you said is exactly right. Okay. But the con is that oftentimes these people tend to dislike listening. They're so focused on problem solving that they tend to neglect listening. And again, not one of these is the perfect way to do it. And really, the perfect way to do it is to be a little bit of each of these. And sometimes you kind of have to be chameleon-like and you need to be relational. And sometimes you have to be analytical and so on and so forth. But it might be dependent on the person with whom you are talking to. Now, there are several barriers to listening. One particular barrier is information overload. So if we go back and we look at these different listening styles, you could see how each one could see information overload as being a barrier. So our relational people, when they hear too many words and they don't get enough attention to emotions, that could be information overload. Or if someone's showing a ton of emotions, that could be information overload. Okay, our transactional people, obviously getting to the point, you could see how information overload would affect them. Our analytical and critical people as well, they're trying to get information, and so sifting through and trying to problem solve with that information could become overload. Secondly, personal concerns. If someone is, let's say, really struggling with mental health, then perhaps you have a personal concern about the person and you tend to ignore what they're saying and instead focus on what might they do, what might their actions be. And then finally, we talked about in week 1 noise with the transaction model of communication. And we talked about physical noise and how physical and psychological and physiological and semantic noise could all be barriers to communication. Likewise, all of those could be barriers to listening. And so I want to end with what are some skills that we can acquire? And depending on the source, you might hear different versions of kind of the same concepts. But I really like Little John and Dominici's listening skills, because they really focus on conflict specifically. And so they have the acronym of LARC, L-A-R-C. And we're going to go through each one of these briefly. The first important listening skill, especially for conflict, is in fact listening. It makes sense, right? Because listening is in itself a skill. But specifically, active listening is a skill. Instead of mindless listening, where we're more hearing than listening, being an active listener is crucial to building the skill of listening. And this means paying attention. This means confirming what the other person says. This means perhaps repeating back to them, this is what I heard you say. Is that correct? Those are the skill of active listening is really important. And part of that is asking questions, knowing how to gather more information, knowing where are the places as they talk to you, where are the gaps in what they're saying, especially as it relates to conflict, and asking questions for clarification, asking questions to get more information. Those are really important skills for listening. The A is for acknowledge. And what they mean by acknowledging what the person says is acknowledging the reality of what they said. So that could be restating. That could be reflecting the feelings of how, not only how you feel about what they're saying, but also how you interpret what they're feeling. Okay, so acknowledging the feelings of all parties involved is really important as we acknowledge, and this even sometimes becomes important as we reframe situations. So what might be a conflict, if we go back to our definition of a realistic conflict, and we talked about perceived scarce resources, reframing something so that you know, what was thought as scarce resources are actually not scarce resources. Reframing it for that person could be a really important part of negotiating and listening. And then finally, summarizing. Okay, summarizing what they said. I hear you when you say this. Those I statements are going to be really part of this next category, which is responding. How do we respond? And there's a couple general principles that Littlejohn and Dominici say. Number one is you have to speak for yourself. You have to speak for yourself. Remember, you can't put words in someone else's mouth, just like someone else can't put words in your mouth. And so as you speak, make sure you're speaking for yourself as it pertains specifically to conflict. Secondly, speak from your own personal experience. If you go back to week 1 and look at that transaction model of communication again, we talked about this idea of environment, and environment means not only the physical environment we're in now, but also what are our past experiences? And how do those shape who we are today? And so many times that is at the center of conflict, is these past experiences that lead us to different ideas about reality. If you've taken the COM 300 class, you might remember the different research paradigms. So we have our post-positivists, and we have our transformativists, and we have our pragmatists. But then we have our constructivists. And our constructivists say everyone is living their own life. Everyone has their own reality, and there's no one true reality. And so taking that idea and putting it into conflict is being able to say, well, based on my experiences, this is what I feel. Or based on my experiences, this is how I see this problem. And then speaking directly to others. And they really focus on I statements. And you're probably somewhat familiar with I statements, if not totally familiar with I statements. But just to reiterate, I statements are statements that begin with I, meaning me. I feel X. Or I felt that a certain situation was wrong because of Y. Or I feel, I feel hurt because of X. Okay, so these I statements are telling the other person how you feel without it feeling like an attack on them. And so if it's coming from you and how you feel, if we go back to one of our principles we talked about earlier in the semester, and that is explicit content, of course, that is don't shit on someone else's feelings. If someone is saying, I feel a certain way, that's their reality. That's their lived reality. And so it's hard for us to contradict how someone feels. And in fact, I would argue, and probably many people would argue, it's not right to try to persuade someone away from what they are feeling. Finally, we have the C, which is commit. This is one of the more unique ones, because up until now, listening and acknowledging and responding, those are really common and thought of as typical ways of responding to conflict, and especially conflict through the lens of listening. But this next one of commit or commitment is really unique to Littlejohn and Dominici. And they say, once you have resolved a conflict, or once you realize you cannot yet resolve a conflict, and you've talked about it, you've responded, you've gone through the LAR, you need to take ownership of this conflict. And what do we mean by that? Or what do they mean by that? Number one is decide on an appropriate course of action. So if you've resolved the conflict, how are we going to negotiate this situation going forward? But if we have not resolved the conflict, what is an appropriate course of action to maintain a good trajectory of resolving the conflict? Okay. And so to do so, we are creating a constructive environment as opposed to a destructive environment. We are trying to construct or negotiate positively for to understand or maybe even get past this conflict or to solve this conflict. And sometimes that means exploring the problem even further. And this could be through trying to get third parties to get involved, mediation. You if you ever watch any of the TV judge shows like Judge Judy, you know that is often over a conflict where people are fighting over, you know, uh, whatever it is, a car or family heirlooms or their a divorce settlement. And so to explore the problem further, they go and seek mediation. But that's not the only way to do it, of course. You can also solve the problem collaboratively, working together. Okay, and those are the typical ways that we can go about committing or owning the decision to continue on a trajectory to solve the conflict. These are that's really the key link between listening and conflict is this C right here, and that is commitment, committing to hearing the other person and committing to solving the conflict.